Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, Closing the Gap Between Government and IT, sponsored by Ironbow and Dell EMC on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests are Tom Sisayla, the Director of the Army Architecture Integration Center in the Office of the CIO G6, Mark Googe, the Chief Technology Officer for the Military Health System, Manoj Thomas, the Cloud Client Computing Sales Specialist for Dell EMC, and Troy Massey, the Director of Enterprise Engagements for Ironbow. We ended the last segment talking a little bit about mobility, or a fair amount about mobility, but one of the pieces of mobility that I think we have to address, especially with our panelists from the Defense Department, is the Common Access Card, the CAC. And this has been a struggle for a lot of agencies, not just from DoD, but every government agency who's been having to implement HSPD-12, the PIV card. How does that work with mobile devices? So I guess let me start with Tom and just ask, how are you addressing this issue of the CAC and virtualization and Windows 10 and all the pieces and parts?
As you know, the Department of Defense was an exceptionally early adopter of the two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication via the CAC Common Access Card. So we've actually built an entire ecosphere around the CAC infrastructure, and that's both good and bad, right? Because now we have this ecosphere and it needs to change. It's going to take some time to change it, but we are significantly further ahead in terms of what I'll characterize as a larger identity or an attribute management problem set. And so the advantage there that it gives us is it does give us the single token, the single identity for all of our users with what is known as the EDI-PI, which is the unique ID on the CAC card that is persistent over time. So when we link those persistent attributes with our dynamic mobile environment, that gives us an ability to bridge a user from their traditional desktop environment to a more mobile-ready environment under VDI to a purely mobile environment on a smartphone or a handheld device, and then carry that all the way down into the field, whether you're on a tactical radio system, right? So this kind of, it's the glue that kind of holds together our infrastructure. And so with Win 10 specifically, that it only continues to bolster and enhance our positioning in terms of bridging the gaps. We've been working very closely with the UK's Ministry of Defence on their OC 0365 migration that they were going through as the department's trying to figure out what their next generation defense enterprise something office suite is. So one of the things they highlighted to us is that there were two things, one of which we talked about earlier, which is I characterize as prepping the battlefield, doing that analysis up front, figure out where you are. We don't want to end up in analysis paralysis where we're just studying the rock forever. But the thing that they highlighted to us was a technological challenge that I don't know that we fully grasped, which was the identity and managing the identity from the internal ecosphere. For us, it's called the DoDIN or the land war net for the Army or whatever, with what I'll characterize as the internet identity, right? So I would imagine most people here have one, if not more, email addresses, whether it's your Google account or your Microsoft Live account or whatever. So they don't talk to each other, right? They're designed, actually, quite honestly, to not talk to each other. That creates a problem if you want to take your internal identity, your internal attributes, and you want to cloud enable in the commercial sector, right? So how do you bridge that internal, ecosphere of compute capabilities and say, Tom Sisayla is Tom Sisayla no matter where he is, whether he's sitting at his desk in the Pentagon or whether he is out in the field using, GChat for one reason or another, if that's something we would choose to do.
It's interesting you bring up this broader idea of identity management, because it's always been seen as, okay, well, how do I log into my computer? How do I physically access ability? And now, as we move into virtualization or as we move into the cloud, it becomes this broader discussion as roles and responsibilities. Mark, you're shaking your head. Talk a little bit about military health system and how you guys are kind of addressing this identity management more broadly.
I say the same challenges in kind of the same ways when we talk about persona management, right? When we talk about that, either the combination of CAC card with the concierge service allows soft search to be rendered from a known, so that my bonding between the one that's going to be issuing and really my authoritative source for that follows that key exchange that allows those certificates to be put down on the device, so allow that person to flow from different machines, right? Because they're going to say, I haven't changed, I'm still the same person. Why do I have these many different experiences really when I need data, app. So I think when we talk about that plan ahead, let's look at a way to kind of streamline not only the way that they do business, but really take the the hardware out of it, abstraction layer of that, so we can work on the persona management as it flows across that. And that's pretty easy to do in a lab early, but when you start putting it out to the enterprise and you haven't done your measure twice, cut once, you're in trouble. You really are, right? And then you have the burning torches on the front lawn. I mean, kind of like they're going to burn down the house on you. And that's what I'm saying about working with the customers, looking at how we provision that, and then learning from industry and other people like us. I think we tend to stay in a cylinder sometimes instead of opening up your eyes to look at more ways to do business, to take that technology or topology and apply that to your use case and your business needs to do that. So I think reusability a lot for those kind of things for us is gaining a lot of traction, and we meet with industry a lot because they're really out there meeting with thousands more people than I can possibly do.
And Troy, one of the things that this leads us down the path as well is around this idea of user, understanding what the user is doing. And maybe it's a little bit of a dirty word to say user monitoring, but really it's with insider threats and understanding roles and responsibilities comes that power. That's really one of the, if you will, from a cyber perspective, a big benefit of the VDI Windows 10 movement.
Yeah, absolutely. So from the cyber perspective and from the performance perspective, so for years we've tried to monitor the users to see what they are doing, what they access, what applications they're using, and how fast that actually is all happening. It's very challenging in the physical world. There's a lot of applications out there that have done it for years, kind of. With the virtualization world, it's very simple. The application response time is plugged into it. It's ready to go. From a security perspective, there's a lot of things Tom and Mark had mentioned about like smartphones, tablets. We talked about thin clients or zero clients. If we talk about going downrange, a lot of risk has always been behind that piece of hardware, being a laptop or whatever we're using downrange, falling into bad hands. With a zero client, they get nothing. There is no data remaining on that device if it is compromised.
And even when we're talking about the container piece, Manoj, you talked about earlier about things that are on a container, even if that gets compromised, that container still is not accessible.
The container is control locked. You still need the same credentials if you're using CAC to get into it. You still have to use CAC to get into it, whether it's on a BYOD or a GFE device. So the protection still is there. It just got mobile, right? And to go back to the cyber piece of it is that Mark mentioned geofencing, right? So that's big. So now I could be anywhere with certain access level, but I may have a different access depending on what floor I am versus a lobby, right? Because now Wi-Fi is enabled in the Pentagon, right? Well, maybe there's a certain location, you may be on Wi-Fi, but because where you are, you don't have access to certain things that you have when you're somewhere else. So with VDI, you kind of have a little bit more control over where the user's coming from, what device they're coming from, and what level of access they have to resources in your data center. So there's all that benefit that comes into it.
And just to be clear, just in case for our audience has not necessarily have heard the term geofencing before, describe it. It's this idea of what?
It's the idea of knowing where the user's coming from, right? From a location perspective, right? And where in the building are they, right? And
lobby versus
lobby
office versus
yep, or you're close to a SCIF, or you're in the SCIF, right? Whatever that may be, so you know where they're coming from. You can't spoof it because there's IPs and all those things that you can track. And based on that, and you mentioned persona management, so there's a bunch of things that come into play to make that geofencing happen. But the end goal is that you can track, you can see what they're doing, where they're going, and what you give them access to.
And so people don't get too kind of upset about this. This is really all about protecting the data.
Cyber.
So it's a cybersecurity play versus I don't trust Tom or I don't trust Mark.
Absolutely. Hey, it's not the user. It's I want to protect my data. It's I have more control over it. Right? So now I can protect it based on who the user is, where they're coming from.
And Tom, that's another piece of VDI that we can talk to as well, is because when you talk about cybersecurity and VDI, and as you mentioned, there's the data center side and then there's the endpoint side. Let me start with the data center side. You mentioned data at rest, data encryption. Those are two huge things that can happen. Talk a little bit about how those benefits come into play from a cyber perspective.
Right. So one of the key things we're trying to strive for is what I'll characterize as a risk adaptive posture, right? And risk comes in many forms. It could be environmental, physical environment. It could come in terms of logical environment, in terms of a cyber attack. So with highly virtualized environments that are dynamic in nature, where this, the notion of network function virtualization, where everything's virtualized, you can stand up or tear down environments or networks at will for multiple reasons. Capacity management, demand management, but also what I'll call information security management. Right. So if you have an environment that you stood up for the sole purpose for a contingency for, let's say, like a hurricane or something, you can tear it down very quickly, archive it. Right. Well, the same can be happen from a cyber perspective. Right. So if you see an ongoing cyber attack and you maybe want to say, hey, I don't want to shut it down. I want to know more about this. Stand up a new environment, right? Maybe redirect them to the new environment to watch them while the actual environment is a little bit more protected or whatever. So the virtualization gives you that. The data center, when you have data encryption at rest, you have data encryption in transit, and legitimate, maybe container-based cryptographic isolation, which Manoj mentioned, right? You get some really powerful tools. Now, there's a balance there, right? Because anytime you employ encryption or any sort of cryptographic techniques, you do have to worry about some key management issues, right? If you were to say create all this isolation and create all these levels of encryption, there's overhead on the processors, there's extra processing power, and if you happen to lose the key, you're kind of not in a good spot. Yeah. So I'm an old ComSec guy from back in my Navy days, so key management's kind of near and dear to my heart. So it's just something to bear in mind that there's all this great technology out there, and there's many vendors that'll tell you, well, I'll give you data encryption rest. I'll encrypt your storage at the byte level, on our storage device, and that's fantastic until you lose the key. So you just got to keep that in mind. It goes back to kind of the process thing that we talked about earlier. You got to have good process in place there.
So let me turn to our vendors to let them respond a little bit to the management issues. Either Troy or Manoj, talk a little bit about this management issues. Before we talked about VDI was in the early stages. Now it's maturing. Are we maturing through those management issues, Troy?
It's kind of funny because we've kind of went from one management issue to the other management issue. So we went out and we deployed all these physical computers, desktops, all over every desk that we could imagine, and then we had an administrative nightmare because we had to control what the users or monitor or patch what the users did to every single desktop out there. Years passed and some desktops got replaced, so now you've got one type of hardware out there, one type of vendor out there. You got to support 15 different types of computers all of a sudden. So we came in this nightmare. Virtualization fixes that. Now we can manage everything, the image, everything back at the data center. Now we introduce management, administration over the data center. So we're kind of taking one for the other as far as administration. And like Tom had mentioned, there's some overhead that happens with performance that can hinder the deployment if not configured properly. So.
And this goes back to the very beginning of the conversation, and as we start to wrap up here, and this has been a great conversation, one of the things that you all mentioned was the assessment, be prepared. So let me start with Manoj and talk a little bit about what should recommendations, advice, as people head down this path, rediscover VDI, rediscover as they move to Windows 10.
So again, knowing your environment is critical, right? Again, I love when people say I want to go VDI, but I always tell them, let's find out what's going on currently in your environment, right? How are the users, their desktops performing? What applications are they using? How many of these applications are they using? So doing an assessment will give you all that information. That's one piece of it, right? But we also talked about networking. Well, we need to know how is the network performing, right? Because you can build this fantastic back-end data center with all the resources you have, but if your network is bad, well, the experience is going to be bad, right? So doing an assessment to find out exactly what's going on, because you don't want to take what's wrong and put it into a data center, it's still going to be wrong, right? You're still going to have bad experience. So that's what I preach all the time. Know what's going on in the environment currently, and let's architect to fix the environment. So you're addressing all the check boxes, right? And along the way, if networking seems to be the issue, well, we need to address that as well, right? So that's important. That's key to be able to do that. And just to go back on the management side, yeah, we move all the management to the data center, but also we have to look at the endpoints, right? Because if you're going to go on install a thin client or a zero client, look at the advantages of doing that and where they fit. Right? So I always say start with a zero client if it fits, because that takes all of the management away from the desktop and you're moving into the data center, right? So and then you move up to the next level of client, ending up maybe with a PC because that's what they have to have. Right.
So. Good point, Troy.
Yeah. So there's no two environments are the same. So agreed. Assessment. It goes not just on the user end, which could change to a zero, thin, or thick client depending on the environment. The network, make sure that we can push that image down to the whatever the client becomes. On the data center side, there could be a possible reutilization of servers, storage that exist now. So we don't know what that is until we get out there and look. So assessment, assessment, assessment.
Again, good point. I think something we always talk a lot about the preparation, but does it happen? Probably not quite enough. Mark, bring us home. You get the last word of the day.
Sure. It's all about the data.
It's all about the data.
Right, and how you utilize the data, right? So those use stories and those plannings are critical to that, so you can do your performance tuning to look at right-sizing your network too, right? To ensure that the data is at the right place at the right time, safely and securely.
All right. Tom, you don't get the last word. Okay. But thank you. How about that? All right. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. You've been listening to the panel discussion, Closing the Gap Between Government and IT, sponsored by Ironbow and Dell EMC on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. I'd like to thank my guests, Tom Sisela, the Director of the Army Architecture Integration Center in the Office of the CIO G6, Mark Guj, the Chief Technology Officer for the Military Health System, Manoj Thomas, the Cloud Client Computing Sales Specialist for Dell EMC, and Troy Massey, the Director of Enterprise Engagements for Ironbow. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsradio.com and search Ironbow.
On behalf of Ironbow and Dell EMC, thank you for joining us. A link to the archive sessions will be sent to you shortly. If you requested training certificates, you will also receive an email with download instructions after the webinar. This concludes our discussion. Thank you.